Okay, now we're going to move to kind of down the chart, or down the poster board to talk about the books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. And I'm going to introduce you to yet another theology.
Did you just make them up now?
This is a big word, and it's a word that scholars came up with, so it's not in the Bible itself, to sort of describe this phenomenon. And
Wait a
so,
minute, they did make it up. You just said they came up with it, and I said you're making them up now, and then you're like, they came up with it.
this one they made up the name. I think the theology is there. I mean, they didn't just make that up. It's
We
in
can't
the
see that.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Deuteronomistic. So it means Deuteronomy. So spell out Deuteronomy and don't put a Y on the end, put an istic on the end. Deuteronomistic is the word.
Yes, you are.
So Deuteronomistic theology, and what I mean by that is that the books of Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings share a theological perspective that's based on the book of Deuteronomy.
That would be a
So-
really great Wheel of Fortune.
Can you say that one more time?
Yeah. The books of Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings share a theological perspective, I don't know what I said, based on the book of Deuteronomy. So let me explain the kind of theology that's there in Deuteronomy, and then I'll give you a couple of examples of how it gets worked out in Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, to show how it's kind of based on this book of Deuteronomy.
Share a theological perspective based on Deuteronomy.
So Deuteronomy, again, is set up as a sort of second law-giving event in the mouth of Moses. He gives this long sermon speech that kind of recounts what has happened in Exodus and Leviticus. And here we have Moses as sort of the lawgiver. He's the one that is in charge. He's the one that's standing on the banks of the Jordan River overlooking the promised land. He's saying, before you go into this land, here's what you need to know. Right? Here are the things to remember. And then what's important about it, if you want to open up to Deuteronomy, I got to find the right chapter. Deuteronomy 28. The way that the book ends is with these blessings and curses. So, blessings for those who are obedient to all that's been described in Deuteronomy, and curses to those who are disobedient to all that was said. So in Deuteronomy 28:1, it reads, "If you only obey the Lord your God by diligently observing all of his commandments that I am commanding you today, the Lord your God will set you high above all the nations of the earth. All these blessings shall come to you and overtake you. Blessed shall you be." Verse 3. Verse 4, "Blessed shall be the fruit." Verse 5, "Blessed shall be your basket." Verse 6, "Blessed shall be you when you come in and when you go out." Right? So attached to this kind of Deuteronomistic theology is a condition. It's conditional. It's not, it matters whether the people obey or not. If they obey all of the commandments, then they will have blessings.
Is that the same as God being like a deal maker, constantly making deals, or is deals not the same thing as?
It's a form of covenant, right, where God is making a covenant. But, sometimes when God makes a covenant with people like David, he says, I'll make an everlasting covenant with you. And there seems to be an implication that it doesn't really matter what you do.
Okay.
Thank goodness in David's case, because I'll be with you. But here, it does matter. It's not so much that you're going to break the covenant if you disobey. It's that there are going to be curses and blessings attached to it.
Would it be grammatically correct to say the blessings are conditional on, based upon obedience or to obedience?
Yeah, based upon obedience.
It's an if-then. If you do this, then you do this.
Exactly. That's a great way to put it.
What'd she say? I didn't hear.
If then. If you do this, then this will happen. So if you obey the laws, then you will be blessed. If you disobey, then you will be cursed. Verse 15 of Deuteronomy 28. But if you will not obey the Lord your God by diligently obeying all his commandments and decrees, which I am commanding you today, then all these curses shall come upon you and overtake you. Verse 16, cursed shall you be. 17, cursed shall be your basket. 18, cursed shall be the fruit. 19, cursed shall be you when you come in and go out. So we have this formulaic understanding of the covenant, right? And Deuteronomy has its own twist on that, and that is, this is not a covenant that you can choose to disobey and there won't be consequences. This is conditional. And so you are to follow God's laws. And if you do that, then good things will happen to you. And if you don't follow then bad things will happen to you. It's an equation. If then, right? Do good things equals blessings. And notice the blessings are, go back to verse 3 and through 5. Your city's going to be blessed. Your field will be blessed. So you'll have, good harvest. The fruit of your womb will be blessed. So you'll have kids. The fruit of the ground, the fruit of your livestock. So your sheep and your goats and your lambs will increase, right? And you'll be blessed when you come in and when you go out. So wherever you travel, wherever you go, you're going to be blessed. And the curses use that same language and just reverse it. Cursed will be your ground. Cursed will be your fruit. Cursed will be your, right? So, and all of this is contingent upon, all of this rests upon whether or not you're obeying God's commandments. So the way this gets worked out in the Deuteronomistic history, the Deuteronomistic theology gets worked out is in this telling through Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. It seems that the authors that wrote those books were influenced by this Deuteronomistic theology.
What's the time period where they're written? Not when they were written, but the time they were based on versus Deuteronomy itself. Joshua, Judges, are they all in the same time period?
Do you want the date when it was written, or do you want the date that it's telling about?
That it's talking about.
Okay, so it's talking about this time period, 1200 to 1000.
And what was the time period of Deuteronomy?
Right before that.
Okay.
Let's say around 1200. Most scholars would say Deuteronomy was written later than that. If you remember, down here in the divided monarchy, King Josiah does this renovation project in the temple, and they find a book of the law. And Josiah's like, holy crap, we haven't been following this. Where'd this book come from? Right? We have a book of order. Right? Like, we should probably follow that. And so he sends out this thing, he has it read to him, which is fascinating, right? Is it because he's high and royal and he needs things read to him, or is it because he can't read?
He's young, so maybe he had.
Right. He has it read to him, and he weeps, and he says, we're changing the whole thing. Everyone, we're going to start obeying this law. What we think is that's an early version of the book of Deuteronomy, right? It's an early version of the book that we now know as Deuteronomy, which says you got to follow all these things, and if you do, blessings will happen. If you don't, curses will happen. So Josiah's reform is that he thinks, okay, let's all get on board with this law book, and then, things will change around here. So a lot of people put the writing of the book of Deuteronomy in that time period, which would be Josiah's like 8th century, so 700s. I want to say 722, but that's the fall. Anyway, so there was apparently within ancient Israel a group of people who emphasized this understanding of God, that if you obey God's laws, good things will happen to you, and if you don't, bad things will happen to you. That's a kind of different, just notice that that's a different kind of understanding of God than just a sort of direct from Sinai, here's what you got to do. Right? This puts a sort of condition on it. And so what we think is that the people who wrote Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings were influenced by this theology, and so that theology is in the background as they tell the history. So they're trying to tell the history. They know Joshua was a leader, and he was faithful, and he conquered, and they divided the land, and they know about Deborah and Gideon and all those people. And as they're telling that story, they're also weaving into that story their theological perspective, which is, if you obey God's commandments, good things will happen to you. If you don't, bad things will happen to you. So if you turn to Joshua, you'll see how this gets worked out. Anybody know about the Battle of Jericho? Joshua chapter 6. Someone just kind of help us, we'll help each other remember what the story's about. It's too long to read in its entirety.
They marched around the walls.
Yes.
And they blew their trumpets.
Yes. How many times did they march around?
7.
7, which is a biblical number, right? Good, Sabbath kind of number. I think they, is this how you normally fight a war? Right? If we wanted the building across the street here to fall down, would we march around it?
I mean, we pray about that, because it would be.
We would maybe pray about it, but we would also hire a wrecking ball or a demolition crew or somebody, right? We would get some equipment out here to help us. So this is not how you fight a battle in the ancient world, marching around it like that. But who told them to march around it and blow the trumpets? God did. And when you listen to God, what happens? Good things happen, right? So in Jericho, this is played out exactly that way. God says to them, go up there, march around it. I think it's one time a day for 7 days, and on the 7th day you march around 7 times, and then you blow the trumpets, and then the walls come down, and then you go in and attack them, right? So, and this is exactly what they do. They follow this ridiculous battle plan. I mean, really, right? It's unbelievable in many ways that this is the way that they choose to fight the battle. And when they follow this plan, all goes according to God's timing here and God's plan, and the walls come tumbling down, right? What happens does anyone remember, so everybody remembers Jericho, but what about Ai? Everyone remembers Jericho, the city, but what about the city of Ai? A-I.
Yeah.
Pronounced I. Do you know about that one?
Don't
Wait
remember.
a second. That's not the one he's flying on the lake.
No, that's right now. Yeah, right now.
And that's right in the beginning.
Yeah, that's at Joshua 2 or something like that. Now, I is in 7 and 8. And this is when Achan sins and does not obey God. Let me see if I can find that.
Jericho?
20. Chapter 7.
It's right in the
7,
beginning of
20.
7.
7, yeah.
But he confesses it in
The sin of
verse 20.
Achan says verse 10.
Well, and then in verse 20 of chapter 7, he says, I have sinned against the
Yeah. So you're putting it together. Verse 10 says, Israel has sinned. They have transgressed my covenant that I imposed on them. They have taken some of the devoted things. They have stolen. So one of the laws is when you go in, you're not supposed to take any of the devoted things. And Achan apparently does take one of those. And so he disobeys God. And so the Israelites, because of this sin, are not able to conquer the city of Ai.
When they say devoted things, do they mean like icons? Or-
Yeah, religious, sacred, yeah,
Inside of that city,
yes.
not the temple or tabernacle, they're just in the city.
Mhm. In the foreign city they're conquering, because, the issue is gonna be, you don't take that because you might end up worshiping it and it's idolatry and all that kind of stuff, right? So that's what they mean by devoted things. So here's the pattern, right? Jericho is the premier example of how to fight a battle, right? By listening to God, even if God tells you to do something that's not really a tried and true battle tactic. Just listen to God and things will happen. Good for you. And Ai is the counter example. If you don't listen to God and you sin, then you don't get the city. You don't get to conquer the city. And so they actually have to go back in, I think, chapter 8 and try to and capture the city again after they repent of their sin. And once Achan and the Israelites have repented of their sin, then they are able to take the city. So the authors of this story could have just told the story. They could have said, they couldn't God didn't need to get involved, right? They could have just said, we went into Jericho, we conquered it. We went into Ai, we weren't able to conquer it the first time, but we got it the second time. But instead, they have a theological reason for why they were successful in one city and not successful in the other. And that theological reason is based on this law book in Deuteronomy, which says if you obey God, then blessings will happen. And if you sin, then bad things are going to happen. Look at Judges now, another example of how the theology gets worked out. Judges chapter 2. If you continue reading through Joshua, you will see that every once in a while that they will claim that they were able to conquer everyone in Canaan and that they were able to take all of the land. And so everyone in the promised land gets conquered. But what you actually see here in Judges chapter 2 is this short little section of verses that talk about how they were not able to conquer all the land. And guess why they weren't able to conquer all the land?
Not a chance.
Because they did not obey God's commandments. Now the angel of the Lord went up from Gilgal, Judges 2:1, to Bochim and said, I brought you up from Egypt, and I brought you into the land that I had promised to your ancestors. And I said, I will never break my covenant with you. For your part, do not make a covenant with the inhabitants of this land. Tear down their altars. But you have not obeyed my command. See what you have done. So now I say, I will not drive them out from before you, but they shall become adversaries to you, and their God shall be a snare to you. And when the angel of the Lord spoke these words to all the Israelites, the people lifted up their voices and wept, which is what Bochim means in Hebrew, is weeping. So there's the connection, tight connection. The reason why we're going to keep some of these people around, you weren't able to conquer them all, the reason why you can't take the whole land is because you did not obey the commandments that I gave you. And one of those big commandments is, I don't know if it says it right, tear down their altars, is this whole foreign idols, foreign worship, false worship that's happening.
And you said it was the Bohemian was what? Weeping?
Weeping, it means weeping. So they wept there, and so they named the place Weeping. So another example in Joshua of how the writer here is shaping the narrative according to their own theological emphasis, which is based on Deuteronomy. Right? Obey good things.
And we still see a lot of this today.
Yes, well, this is where I'm headed, is I'm hoping that some of you all are discomforted by this theology and find it hard to stomach. Let me give you one more example, and then I want to have that exact conversation. Then when you get to the book of Kings, I'm going to have to kind of, let me see where I want to find an example. I thought they're all over the place. Let's go to 1 Kings 15. I'm randomly picking out, it happens so often, this same pattern, that I just randomly opened up and it fell to 15, and I'm going to use that as an example. That's how prevalent this pattern is. When we get to 1 and 2 Kings, we get to the time period of the divided monarchy, where there's a kingdom of Israel and Judah, and the kings are introduced, and how long they reigned, right, and when they died, and that sort of thing. And it's this brief. Sometimes there's a long story about the kings, if they like Hezekiah and Josiah. Some of the kings, though, there's just a brief little paragraph about them. And guess how the kings of Israel and Judah are judged as to whether they were a good king or a bad king.
Whether they walked in the way of God.
Whether they walked in the ways of God, whether they obeyed the commandments. Right? It wasn't whether they liked Coke or Pepsi. Right? It wasn't whether they were in a difficult political situation, right? It wasn't whether how powerful Assyria was and breathing down their necks. That's not mentioned. The historical kind of political reality is not mentioned. What is mentioned is the Deuteronomistic theology of whether they walked in the ways of God. So look at 1 Kings 15, verse 25. Someone read verses 25 and 26 for me. Nadab.
Now Nadab, the son of Jeroboam, became king over Israel in the 2nd year of Asa, king of Judah, and he reigned over Israel 2 years. And he did evil in the sight of the Lord, and walked in the way of his father, and in his sin, which he made Israel sin.
Yep. Good. And it goes on and says a little bit more about him, Nadab, in 27 through 31. But then it tells you if you want to read some more about it, then go look at the book of the kings of Israel, right? Which we don't have access to. We're still trying to find that book. But notice how he is introduced, right? We're given his name, we're given his father's name, which is how you identify people in the ancient world, and maybe even today, right? And then he began to reign, how long he reigned, for 5 years or 2 years, right? And then immediately, verse 26, yeah, we don't get to know if he had wives and a kid. We don't get to know what his favorite color was. We don't get to know where he went to church. We don't get to know, right, any of that, right? Straight to, he did evil. That's what matters, according to the author. I'm being facetious and playful because there are so many other things that we could know about someone. There are so many other criteria for how you judge an ancient king. Like Solomon, we know a lot about him and how he expanded the kingdom and he built the temple, right? So there's the possibility of knowing a lot more. And how he had 800 wives and that many concubines and all that, right? We've got all this other information. But when he gets down to these lists of kings, what we find is an introduction about them and whether they did obey God or not. So just look around, flip through 1 Kings and see if you can find me another example. Well, I already found another one. I'm quicker than you. 1629 says, in the 38th year of King Asa, son of Judah, Ahab, son of Omri, began to reign. And Ahab, son of Omri, reigned over Israel and Samaria 22 years. Ahab, son of Omri, did evil in the sight of the Lord more than all who were before him. He was particularly terrible. Another example? 1533, King Asa reigned for 24 years. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, walking in the way of Jeroboam, who was one of Solomon's kids, and in the sin that he caused Israel to commit.
Well, and then in 22, 1 Kings 22:41. Because it's a little bit different because it's got more information, but it says he walked in the way of his, 43, he walked in the way of his father Asa. He did not turn aside from doing it, doing what was right in the sight of the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
Even though other things, he didn't destroy the high places.
Right. So he still gets he gets judged on this same criteria. This time he does it right, doing what was right in the sight of the Lord. The way that 1 Kings ends in 22, since we're in 1 Kings 22, is by talking about King Jehoshaphat, or excuse me, Ahaziah, I guess. And look at what it says about him in 52 and 53. He did what was evil, walked in the ways of his father and mother, in the way of Jeroboam, which we know is not good, and who caused Israel to sin. He served Baal, the Baals, and worshipped him, and he provoked the Lord, the God of Israel, to anger, just as his father had done. So the criteria is whether or not you are worshiping God, you're following God's commandments. And God's commandments are you only worship one God, and you don't worship all these Baals, and you don't worship at foreign altars. You don't set up high places and worship there. And if those places are around, then you get rid of them. Remember, these are kings. These are not priests, right? So they're judging a king who is a political figure by his religious commitments.
You don't think that's awesome? I do.
I think that it is one way of judging someone, absolutely. I mean, characterizing someone, right, is by their religious commitments, right? So I'm not putting a good or bad on it. I'm just trying to notice the pattern, right? Which is this is how the Deuteronomistic theology characterizes the kings. And I'm just simply pointing out there would be other ways to do it. For example, and some of those ways would be less helpful in other ways, right? Like we could judge people based on whether they're left-handed or right-handed. And so it could have said King Josiah reigned for 2 years, but he was left-handed, so he did what was evil on the side of the Lord. Right? And it's like, that's an interesting way to do it. Like, okay. Right? And so this way is obviously a little more substantive than left-handed and right-handed, a little more deliberative in that it's about how you walk and obey God's commandments. That's a theological perspective. So the place where it gets tricky for me, if I do start thinking about judging it, is those poor kings that had no ability to maneuver and had no, who may have been between a rock and a hard place. In other words, the Assyrian army is, basically there and they're a vassal to them. Israel or Judah is, and there's really the king really is powerless in that situation, and yet is still being sort of judged by this certain criteria, right? So more nuance. It's not a complete picture, is what I'm trying to say. Right? It's not a total description of their reign.
I don't understand what you said. You said if the Assyrians there, that the king has not a lot of ways to handle things.
Because they're oppressed by another foreign power.
Right. But wouldn't you also have, if they're judging them this way, wouldn't you want somebody that follows the commandments of the Lord in power anyway? And if they did, then it would be up to God whether they beat the Assyrians or not. And if they didn't, then that would be where the cursings came from. Correct? Yes, no?
Yeah, no, I'm with you. You want someone who's obeying God's commands, but what if, as the king, you are not really fully in control of your kingdom, so you can't declare, everyone tear down all the high places, because the Assyrians have already said, you're not tearing down any of those. If you do, I'm going to kill you. Right? Or if you do, I'm going to come in and invade. Like, All the high places have to stand. Everyone's going to worship the Assyrian god or whatever, right? So the Israelite king then has no real control over this one criterion by which they're being judged. So again, to go back to the kind of ridiculous left-handed, right-handedness, it's like, I'm going to judge you whether you're left-handed or right-handed, and you have no say in it in this case, right? You're just born with a dominant hand. Right? So that's where it gets really interesting, is this theology has limited down what is good and basically created two moral categories and has slotted everyone into those two categories based on one criteria, kind of one narrow criteria that doesn't have a lot of nuance in it. That it just assumes these kings are always able to choose the good and reject the evil. That these kings are always able to control their whole kingdom. Like, what if you say, tear down all the high places, and the people say, no? Right? You go, well, I'm going to get judged badly by the book of 1 Kings, so you better tear them all down, right? And then people say, no, we like them. We like to worship idols. We really like them, right? And so then you get two sentences, you end up with two sentences in the Bible about you, and it says you did evil in the sight of the Lord, when maybe in reality you went around saying, tear them down, tear them down, tear them down, and everyone ignored you.
And so now, if something bad happens to you, you must have done something wrong.
Yeah, so now let's move to the kind of contemporary, kind of, the way that I see this theology at play, which both of you all have kind of talked about today, which is, this is such a prevalent theology in the Old Testament, since it comes in Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, that it also is a theological undercurrent in many of our Christian traditions today, right? Which say, if you believe, if you have enough faith, right, then good things will happen to you, right? If you listen to God, if you're faithful, if you obey God's commandments, then you will have blessings. And if you don't listen to God, then you will be cursed.
Is that the same concept when some people in different denominations may say, well, because of your sin, you have cancer, and if your faith is high enough, you'll be healed from cancer? Because I've heard that before. Like, you know, you're suffering with this type of illness because of some sin in your life, and obviously your faith isn't strong enough because, you know, whatever.
Right. If the equation is, if you obey God, blessings will happen. If you don't obey God, curses will happen. Then you can reverse that equation. If you are currently experiencing curses.
That's not even reality, because if you continue to read the word on through, we're not promised a peaceful,
Right.
easy life.
Right.
So you'd have to do a lot of justification just to stick to that.
The place where it was most striking was I was a worker in the camp where they brought people here to West Virginia after Hurricane Katrina. And that was one of the things that was said to those people. Oh, if you hadn't lived such a riotous, ungodly life, then God wouldn't have flooded New Orleans.
None of us are exempt from experiencing anything. I mean, God will be with us through it, but none of us are exempt
That's
from.
not the Deuteronomy
That's what,
theology.
yeah, but
Yeah.
this was.
God being with us through it is not not yet on the page here. So that's what's so interesting, right? That's a different way of understanding evil and suffering. So what we're really talking about here is theodicy, right? What we're really talking about here is the problem of suffering and evil in the world.
Did you say, what was the word you said?
Theodicy.
It's common on
Prosperity
TV.
gospel.
Prosperity.
Does the prosperity gospel fit in this?
This is the prosperity theology. This is the early version of
Is that like
prosperity
name it and claim it?
Mhm.
Oh, Lord have mercy.
I can't.
This is the early version of it. So theodicy, T-H-E-O, Theo, and dicy, D-I-C-Y. Theodicy is justification of God. It's how do you understand God in the face of suffering and evil. Right? And so one way to understand God's relationship to suffering and evil is to say, if you're faithful and listen to God, you will not suffer. You will have blessings. And if you don't, then you'll have curses and you will suffer. So if you find yourself suffering, that must mean you are not listening to God. So for an example of that, an example I heard once was a preacher say that he had never gotten a cold Okay.
Uh,
Head cold, in which he hadn't figured out that he needed to repent of something,
Yeah,
I hear that a lot too.
right? That's this theology at work, right? There must be, a germ went up in my nose and infected my body, I must have done something wrong. Isn't that an interesting way to pull two things together,
What-
right?
you know, when COVID happened, some of our session members even were saying, well, I'm not sure why God brought this. Yeah, it was just, why did God do this to us? I'm like, God's walking through it with us, but I don't.
Get sick after he says something like that.
To the what?
I want to say,
Good point. Okay, good point.
Right,
Bam.
I've never had a head cold before, and the next day you're like,
right.
what? Well, that's just dumb. That's just foolish, really, is the word.
So it's one way of spinning out God's relationship to suffering. Another way is what you offer to us, which is that, just because you're suffering doesn't mean that God doesn't like you or punishing you. In fact, the promise is that God will be with you no matter where you are. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. Right? So God's presence among you in blessing and in curses. Right? But that's a different understanding of God than what we have on offer here. Right? Here we have a kind of equation. You wanted to jump in.
She was able to answer my question. I was just gonna ask you to repeat the definition of theology.
Okay, perfect.
Appreciate you.
Yep. So, yeah, I mean, in some ways it is kind of, prosperity theology has sort of taken it to a different level because really that is about mostly material kinds of stuff, right? It's not about kind of spiritual blessings. It's about physical blessings. Like, I'm a faithful preacher, I deserve a private jet. Right? That's
Prevalent
I'm
now.
obeying God. I am doing God's will. Therefore, I deserve blessings. It's just that my blessing, instead of being a donut or something, is like cars and
Airplanes.
planes or whatever it may be. Right? And if I don't have that, right? If I do get sick or I do get cancer or whatever might happen, then to kind of reverse the equation, it must mean that there's something unfaithful or something
How do you
wrong.
get entire state of people to buy into that or reverse that?
Well, they didn't all believe it. That was what was hurled at them.
But you have to think, why would anybody buy into that? You would have to think that if it was just based on their own sin, that only their house would have got flooded. See what I'm saying?
Yeah, the whole city.
But
had
the
to be
whole
equal.
city, the whole city was sinful.
Right, except if you look at that first example where they couldn't conquer Ai, it was one guy who was taking the sacred objects, and so the whole plan fell apart because this one guy was evil.
Yeah, it affects the whole community, right? The one person.
But then Lot asked for the deliverance of a
Right.
city on the basis of
Right.
one faithful person in the city.
Yeah.
You got the opposite too.
So it seems clear that many of you all have encountered this kind of thinking, right? I think it's pretty prevalent, and I don't know why. To come back to your question, I mean, my kind of tentative answer to why would people believe that way is because it's pretty clear cut and simple, isn't it? I mean, at least it gives you the agency to know what you did wrong. So, right? So it's a kind of quick answer. It's like, well, I'm sick. Well, then you're unfaithful, which means go read your Bible more, right? But then it's like, well, I did. I've been reading my Bible, and I've been going to church, and I've been a good person. I've been giving money away, and I'm still sick, right? And so at some point, the theology is going to start to show it's going to wear down, right? It's going to show that it's unhelpful. But at least initially, it promises something too. But initially, it kind of gives you a clear-cut answer of why things are going wrong.
Gives you
And in the midst of suffering, I think it's only human to be like, why? Why is this happening to me? Right? So I don't know when people get cancer and get really, really, that's just sort of a natural thing to say, why? And so this theology comes in and says, I know exactly why. And that actually can be comforting to people in a kind of really perverse kind of way, right?
Because you have an explanation.
It's an excellent.
There's some aspect of predestination.
What did he say? I didn't hear.
I said, is there some aspect
it is a kind of it is a kind of, how do I want to say it? Not
Now, see, where you
crisis.
took a
I
turn
was
down
not
the
thinking
wrong
Word
road.
of it.
I was not listening to God's
No, it's a broken easel.
Okay, there we go. Look at that. I'm back to being faithful. Okay. So, there's a kind of fatalism, maybe I would want to say. There's a kind of, to it, where it's easily, you don't have a lot of agency, or you don't have a lot of, I'd have to think about how that relates to the kind of predestination, which is about like the knowing ahead of time, right? This kind of already lets us know in some ways what's going to happen, or at least, so yeah, I think they are tied together.
And it's a works righteousness.
Yeah, there's a good
Yeah,
one
it is
there.
works of righteousness.
Yeah, where's grace? Right, where is grace? And it's kind of-
In verse 4 of chapter 15, no, verse 5, and David did good in the sight of the Lord except for Uriah.
Right.
I love that.
Yeah, exactly.
In this, in Deuteronomy, if I'm looking at the papers, going even back to Sinai theology, or even covenant theology, we've already seen grace at work.
Absolutely.
So why did they take it back out? Because they were doing wrong. Because that takes a lot of faith to be thinking that you're so perfect. Right?
Yes.
I wake up in the morning and my husband did not make my coffee. I'm already like, you're lazy. So now, I haven't got out of bed yet. I'm done, right?
Yep. I think instead of thinking of them as sort of progressing from one to another, like first they thought this and then they thought this, and then they thought this, that all of these existed within the community.
Kind of like they do now.
Yes. So here are the Baptists and here are the Methodists, and here, right? So they're all there and they're all producing their literature, right? They're all writing what they think, right? And it all gets canonized, so that there is multiple ways of being. Instead of them thinking of them as kind of progressing through stages, so that they used to believe this and then they started believing something crazy, right? Or and then they're going to go on down, right? That these are kind of the different streams underneath that are all happening simultaneously. It's not one river.
Okay, which makes it even worse because they know that grace exists. They're living in an era where it already exists and they're choosing to not. They want to be legalistic.
Yes, but I don't know how that's any different than us today. I mean,
It's not, but I'm just saying that
I love to deny
puts it
grace
into
in my life.
perspective, different, as today, we haven't learned anything.
Right.
Well, but if, going back to the covenant with Abraham, you'll have a land. And the covenant with Moses, you'll have the land. And then they didn't, I mean, as you said earlier, they didn't just cross over and the land was theirs, but they had to defeat those living in the land, and then they didn't. So they had to have some explanation for why they hadn't defeated them. Why, if God was giving them the land, they had, and so it was easier to blame themselves than say that God was wrong.
Yes. I mean, that is a great point theologically. This does not put the problem on God. It puts it on us, right? So in that way, right, they don't want to say, there must be something wrong with God that we didn't get all this land, right? They put it back on themselves, which I think is a really strong human kind of intuitive thing to do as well. But you're right, they're looking over the hill and they see those people over there that are still around, and God promised them they're going to take it all, and they're like, well, there's the Jebusites. What are they doing over there, right? Like, what's going on with that? And so they think, oh, we must have not been faithful.
Well, and when they didn't get I.
Right. Yeah. And that I story is such a great example of kind of the way it gives you leverage to know what you did wrong so that you can correct it. So they repent, right? Get right with God. Achan does, and then they're able to they're able to conquer I next, right? So that it creates this kind of problem solution. We know what to do. What it doesn't do a good job of, I would say, is really giving us kind of robust understanding of suffering.
Or patience, perhaps. They just haven't waited long enough to do the things they had to do to get the land.
Right, yeah. So, know pastorally that it's unhelpful in the face of someone who is suffering to say, have you thought about the fact that you might not be very faithful?
Which is exactly what Job's friend said.
Well, so I have 8 minutes left before lunch, and that's exactly where I was going, right? The anecdote to this, or the answer to this, or the opposition to this is Job, the story of Job, is an check out this word. This is the word this is the word for church parties. Job is an anti-Deuteronomistic theologian.
Oh, man. How many points would that get us in scrap?
Job is an anti-Deuteronomistic theologian. Now, why is he an anti-Deuteronomistic theologian? Do we remember Job?
Because he was good.
He was. He was really good.
He was good, and even when he was afflicted, he didn't blame God.
So we have to find Job.
And he didn't blame it on himself.
No.
He didn't say I'm good.
The way that Job 1 starts out with is, there once was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job.
Wouldn't it be too that he was falling back on the mercy of God?
This is right after Esther and right before the Psalms, I think. As soon as it introduces us to Job, it says that man was blameless and upright. Does anyone have a different translation? Blameless and upright. I'm looking. I think I have the New Revised Standard. One who feared God and turned away from evil. That sounds like a good. He should have blessings according to Deuteronomistic theology. He's turning away from evil and he's a good guy. And there was born to him 7 sons and 3 daughters. Well, that is a blessing, mostly. That was a joke. He had 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen. Blessings, blessings, so many servants, greatest of all the people. His sons would go and hold feast in one another's houses. So you can just imagine with me the Deuteronomistic theologian, whoever wrote Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, starting off reading Job thinking, oh, this guy's got it all. This is the perfect example. We should put him in our book as the model for how this should go. He's blessed, he's blameless, and look at all of the blessings he has. Remember, Deuteronomy said you'll have blessings in your field, you'll have blessings in your the fruit of your womb, something. I don't remember the phrase, right? Meant children. Look, he's got children. He's got sons and daughters. And then what happens? One day, verse 6, the heavenly beings came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also among them. And the Lord said, where have you been? And Satan said, well, I've been going around the earth, walking around, taking my exercise. And the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job? There is no one like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil. And Satan said, does Job fear God for nothing? Wonderful question, right? Job's got everything. Why wouldn't he fear you? Why wouldn't he serve you? Have you not put a fence around him and his house and all that he said? And so God says, very well, all that he has is in your power. But only do not stretch out your hand against him. And so what happens by the end of chapter 1?
Everybody.
He loses it all. Curses, 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 curses. And so if the Deuteronomistic theologian was writing this, right, chapter 2 would start off, and Job realized that he was a terrible person, that he had not obeyed God, right? And so that's the reason why all this happened, is because he was not walking in the ways of his ancestors. And so Job repented, and then Job got back all of his animals and all that kind of stuff, right? Instead, Job basically, for chapter after chapter after, long chapter, it's hard to follow, basically says, nope, I didn't do anything wrong.
Yep.
And friends come to him and say, are you sure? Maybe you should think about, did you do something last Saturday? Maybe you should think about that. Or did you think about that? And he keeps saying, nope, 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 nope. I didn't do anything. So a response to this kind of understanding that if you just follow God, good things will happen. If you're not following God, Job is the example of someone who was blameless and upright and followed God's commandments, and still he lost it all.
except his faith, which was miraculous.
Except it was, what'd you say?
His
Except-
faith.
Oh, right, yes.
His faith.
Yep. He
did not-
lost all of his children and his livestock, that's right. But he didn't lose his faith in God. Yeah.
And that's kind of like this awesome slap in Satan's face. God's like, no matter what you do, I'm still going to overcome this.
Yep.
Yep.
So is there another stream of theology in Job?
Yes. So, I don't know what we want to call that. Let me think about what I'm going to add up here. Because it's not quite wisdom, but it's a different understanding of God, right? It's actually a pretty, if you continue to read through Job, you're going to find it's a pretty courageous understanding of God, in which Job is pretty honest with God, kind of like the Psalms are, as to how Job is feeling. Job doesn't hold things back a lot, kind of lets God have it. And if you remember, God shows up in a whirlwind and starts talking about where were you when the foundation just
Right.
doesn't answer any of Job's sort of questions. Job's like, I'm trying to talk about now, and you're talking about the foundation of the world, a little off topic. And God sort of overwhelms him with sort of, who do you think you are? I'm God. And Job actually comes back and says, thank you for that, but I still have my issue. And God responds again. And we don't really actually get it kind of clear. I mean, at the end, Job says, where's that? Finally, at the end, he does kind of admit, I know that, in 42, I know that God, and Job says, I know that you can do all things and no purpose of yours can be thwarted. And kind of, who is this that hides counsel without knowledge? And I've heard, by the hearing of my ear, and now my eyes see, and therefore I repent. Right? So there's this really interesting kind of ending there, where Job does sort of humble himself and say, maybe I don't understand the whole picture. Right? Maybe I don't get it all. Maybe there's something, maybe the point of what God is doing here is to say, I'm big and mysterious and in charge, and unless you created the world, why don't you back up a little bit, right, and give me some space, because that's what I did. I created the world.
It's the mystery theology.
Yeah, there you go.
Beyond understanding.
Yeah, the beyond understanding.
I have a public service.
I think it's to put Satan in his
Please.
place
My
theology.
wife has reserved a couple of tables at a place about a block and a half away.
Perfect.
So,
We're at a stopping point, so that's perfect.
okay.
Yeah, so let's call it done for now. It is